Thank you, Nick. I want to tell you about a debate I saw on TV not long ago, and I'm embarrassed to tell you where I saw it. It was on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and no, I do not watch Oprah as a matter of practice, but I do tune in when the topic's on abortion. And in this particular case, the topic was abortion. Here's the scenario. Molly Yard, who was representing the National Organization for Women, was debating the leader of a pro-life organization who will remain nameless. And here was the question: will granting restrictions on abortion cause women to die by the thousands in the back alleys of America at the hands of illegal abortionists? That was the question. The pro-abortion spokesperson, Molly Yard, said, yes, indeed it will. They will die by the thousands. Blood is going to run in the streets. And the pro-life spokesman said, that won't happen because it didn't happen that way before. The pro-abortion person said, yes, it did. The pro-life person said, no, it didn't. The pro-abortion person said, yes, it did. Pro-life person said, no, it. You get the picture? No, yes, no, yes, no, yes. Who got the better of that debate? Molly Yard did. You know why? Because the public is more skeptical of the pro-life position than it is the pro-abortion position. And Molly Yard won that debate because the pro-life spokesperson refused to do something that would have leveled the playing field immediately. And we're going to talk about what that is in just a moment. But I want to tell you what our topic is tonight. We're going to talk about why pro-lifers fail to communicate. What is it pro-lifers do in communicating their views that causes us at times to not succeed? And what do we need to do if we're going to succeed with a public that is becoming increasingly more and more skeptical of our position? And we're going to take a good hard look at what that is tonight so that we can fix it and hopefully not that happen to you. You've got a handout, and I want to begin under number 1, letter A. Why do pro-lifers fail to persuade? The first reason is they fail to carry good documentation to back up their claims. They fail to carry good documentation. Now let's recast that whole Molly Yard debate. Let's imagine that when Molly Yard started saying women are going to die by the thousands from illegal abortions, imagine if the pro-life spokesperson had pulled out a document from the president of Planned Parenthood indicating that women never did die by the thousands from back alley abortions. And what if she had used Molly Yard's own information against her on national TV? Do you think that would have had a change in how that was perceived? I guarantee you it would have had a change in how that was perceived. But she didn't do that. What is the goal of abortion advocates? Their goal, ladies and gentlemen, is confusion. They want to confuse the American public, because if the truth gets out, they start losing. Many of you have been following the partial birth abortion debate. You may have noticed that in public opinion surveys, and not just one I might add, but several, support for legalized abortion is dropping because of all the discussion on partial birth abortion. And how did the abortion advocates try to deal with that initially? They tried to deal with it by lying, by confusing the public. Their goal is confusion. Our goal is clarification. And who's got the easier job? They do, because all they have to do is preserve the status quo. What is the status quo in America today? Any woman can kill any baby at any point in the pregnancy for any reason or no reason. That is the status quo in America today. They have the easier job. We've got to convince the public and do it overwhelmingly if we're going to succeed. And that debate on the Oprah Winfrey Show was not an example of the pro-lifer convincing people with overwhelming evidence that she was right. She didn't do it. She failed to do it. So the first thing is they failed to carry good documentation. Now I'm going to risk here using myself as an example, but I'll do it anyway. Sometime back I got a phone call from KCOP Channel 13 News saying, will you come down to our studio and participate in a television debate on RU486? And by the way, you're debating a doctor. And oh, by the way, we want you in an hour and a half. Very typical. The pro-life spokesperson always gets the call at the last minute. The pro-abortion doctor probably knew about it for days, but nonetheless, I decided to go. Now, I will tell you up front, I knew who this doctor was. She's very good on TV. She looks good. She's, endearing to people who watch her. She's articulate. And I also knew what she was going to say on RU46. The topic was, is RU46 a safe drug for women to be using? Is it a safe drug? And I was going to argue that it has some real problems. And I knew the only way that I could possibly come out of there alive was if I could use her own evidence against her. And that's what I attempt to do, and I'm going to show you the clip. I don't pretend to look better on TV than she does, but I'll let you judge whether on a content level I got the better of this clip. So let me show it to you, if I can figure out technology. And I want you to watch the power of holding up the other side's own material.
The wait now is for the information to help with labeling instructions for doctors and patients. Now, there's so much more we still haven't heard in this debate, so we've invited a few people on both sides of the issue to join us here today in studio. Joining me right now are Dr. Vicki Hoofnagel, who supports a women's right to an abortion, and Scott Klausendorf, who is pro-life. Welcome to both of you this afternoon. Thank you for both coming in. We appreciate your time. We've heard so much on the pro side, Mr. Klausendorf. Your concern is?
The pro-life movement opposes the use of RU46, and because it stops a baby's heart that has already started to beat, injures women, and if the baby does happen to survive the abortion procedure, can be critically deformed and can cause unnecessary burdens to that child. We have evidence of that through the medical literature. There's much that has been written in peer-reviewed medical journals that talk about the dangers of RU46, and we are very concerned that this procedure is being ramrodded through for political reasons rather than being truly concerned about the safety of women.
Okay, we have a doctor right here who's going to say something now. What do you think about this? Is it safe?
Well, it certainly has complications. All medications do, but the use of the drug is usually right after a missed menstrual cycle. So there is not a heartbeat developed. It usually just removes tissue that's potential to make a fetus. And that's where it's most effective. It's most effective very early on in a pregnancy, and thus it reduces many complications for women, including having a surgical termination. So it is very effective with less risk than we're hearing because it's supposed to be used earlier.
If I could just interrupt there, I think that is an incorrect statement. The pill is used effectively from 4 weeks to 7 weeks gestation. A baby's heart begins beating at 21 days. That's a whole week ahead of the time when this pill is used. So it's accurate to say that a baby's heart is beating at the time this pill is used. It is inaccurate to say that it is simply a mass of tissue or potential grouping of cells, as we might say.
Catch the toss.
The toss is easy, is that no, nobody reads a thing and says, oh, I'm going to wait till I'm 4 weeks pregnant. If you're a week late, a couple days late, you're not going to wait if you want to terminate, and that's really misinformation, and women are not that stupid. Women want to take things earlier, have safer care for themselves. It is true that the heartbeat can be seen at about 5 weeks post-menstrual cycle, not fetal age, which is very different.
I'm holding here an article from Hippocrates, a medical journal for doctors, that indicates that RU46 does kill a baby whose heart is beating, and they talk about women seeing their unborn child in the toilets and in the clinics after the abortion. This is from a pro-abortion journal, not from a pro-life journal, and that is only one of many sources I have here with me today that indicate that a baby is killed through RU46 and that it is not safe for a woman's health.
Wow. Two. Language is wrong.
Yeah.
It's not a baby. It's an embryo. It's a developing embryo, and the timing is very different.
We can play name games all we want, but the medical facts speak for themselves, and I've presented evidence to say that. And my question is, why should we believe the doctor when she cited no evidence to back up what she's saying?
Just read a journal. Just look at an ultrasound. Just talk to a woman. And the other issue is that we need choice. And people are frightened to go for surgical terminations because they're afraid that they're going to be killed or the doctor's going to be killed.
But you guys have said all along that surgical abortions are safe.
Folks,
I'm not a guy, I'm sorry.
We can go on for hours with this. Thanks so much for coming in this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
We appreciate it. Thank you for both of you.
What I hope you saw there is that the power of holding up the other side's material is devastating when they're lying. When they are lying and you can catch them lying, you will automatically come out looking better, even if you're not as photogenic as she was. Now, you may have noticed that when I called her on her misinformation, she resorted to an ad hominem attack. I'm not a guy. I'm not a guy. Don't call me a guy. That's the kind of thing you're going to see again and again and again, and it's the kind of thing that could have happened on the Oprah Winfrey show if the pro-life spokesperson had used the same technique. So the first problem is pro-lifers fail to carry good documentation to back up what they're saying. Second thing, letter B, yes, they failed to restore meaning to the word abortion itself. They failed to restore meaning to the word abortion. Ladies and gentlemen, the word abortion has lost almost all of its meaning to most Americans. When you and I say the word abortion, we think of an act of violence that kills a baby. But you know what? John Q. Public out there, when he hears the word abortion, what does he think of? A rather innocuous, benign procedure that's carried out by a skilled medical staff that removes a mass of tissue. That's what John Q. Public thinks of. We think of it as killing a baby. He thinks of it as removing tissue mass. In fact, I've gotten to the point where I tell pro-lifers, if you don't level the playing field, you might as well be talking about stock options, because what you mean by the word is not what the public means by the word abortion. And you'll just be talking right past people because their idea of what abortion is not what your idea is. In fact, if you're wondering why that is, why is it that the word abortion has lost all meaning? There's a couple of reasons. The first is we live in a society now that thinks and learns visually. We live in a society that thinks and learns visually. People don't make decisions any longer, generally speaking, on the basis of critical thinking, linear thinking, logical thought. They make decisions based on feeling, experience, and sight, vision-oriented. In fact, some of you may have read the book Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. If you've not picked that book up, I highly recommend it. Neil Postman has observed, he's a social critic, by the way, he has observed that with the advent of television 50 years ago, America shifted from being a word-based culture with a focus on deep, careful thought to an image-based culture where we make decisions randomly according to feeling and visual perception. In fact, he cites a very interesting case study. He says, 130 years ago, crowds stood to listen to Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debate slavery. In fact, at the debate they did in Peoria, Illinois, Douglas opened the debate with a 3-hour opening statement, followed by Lincoln, who said, I'm going to speak for just as long, ladies and gentlemen, go home for a half hour, grab dinner, and come back. And do you know everybody came back? And did I mention the crowd was standing, listening to this? I will tell you as a former pastor that if you preach a sermon that goes longer than 20 minutes, you're doomed. You are in trouble. Listen to any of the seeker-sensitive church growth guys we got out there today, and they will to a man tell you, cut your sermon down. It used to be 20 minutes. Now they're telling you to do it in 12. And have lots of drama and all kinds of other stuff because people can't track with you if you're going to get too philosophical with them. That's what we mean when we say we live in a visual culture. So is it any wonder that people are making very, very poorly reasoned decisions about abortion when they're not thinking the issue through at all? They're thinking and they're learning visually, and we're not talking their language. That's why it's so frustrating to us all, and I think we can all relate to this. We talk to somebody, they look at us and say, yeah, I think abortion's a bad thing, but it ought to be legal anyway. How can that be? How can there be such an incoherent thinking process going on there? In fact, Dr. Jack Wilkie, in a major study he sponsored a couple of years ago, found that the public, by and large on abortion, holds completely contradictory opinions about it. For example, 60% of the American public says that abortion is morally wrong. Good news, right? All the pro-lifers are happy? Not so fast. 60% also say that no one but the woman should decide the issue. No one but the woman. They say, yes, it's wrong, but no one but the woman should decide it. 65% say that no one should tell a woman what to do with her body, but 79% say they support restrictions on abortion. 65% oppose tax money being used for abortion, but 53% disagree with legislation that would prohibit tax dollars from being used to discuss abortion. It gets better. 73% favor more attention to the rights of the unborn, but 65% say no one should tell a woman what to do. And finally, 77% agree there's too many abortions, but 70% would keep it legal anyway. That's why when I see pro-life opinion polls come out that seem to indicate the public opposes abortion, I don't get too excited, because most of those polls don't go to the next level, which is, should abortion be illegal? Should unborn children be protected by law? What you will find is a total breakdown of what appears to be, at first glance, a pro-life consensus. Then the most disturbing aspect of this, not only is there a lack of coherence, not only do we live in a culture that thinks and learns visually, we live in a disinterested public. 50% of the public, ladies and gentlemen, 50%, listen to this, want the abortion issue to just go away. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to deal with it. They want it to just go away. That's very bad news for us. Very bad news for us. How do we reach people like that? How do we reach people that are disinterested? How do we reach people who have no coherent position on this issue? How do we reach people that think and learn visually? One of the things we have to do is learn to use visual aids like the one I'm going to show you in just a moment. I mentioned a moment ago that if we don't restore meaning to the word abortion, we're almost wasting our time. We are almost wasting our time. And I say, in my speaking to pro-lifers, I tell pro-lifers, look, if you don't first show people abortion, it's going to be very difficult to talk to them about abortion. And this was brought home to me not long ago in Harper's Magazine. Harper's Magazine is not a friend to conservatives, it's not a friend to pro-lifers, but in a cover story on abortion, Harper's asked a pro-abortion journalist to write an expose on a Milwaukee abortion clinic, but here's the twist to the story. They weren't asking the journalist to write an expose on the clinic, they were asking the journal to write an expose on the pro-life protesters outside the clinic. And this journalist, who was pro-abortion by his own admission, lurched at that and said, yes, I'll do that. And for the first half of this article, which is rather lengthy, he goes on to use every demeaning term he can to discuss the people outside the clinic who are trying to talk to women about having abortions. Until about halfway through the article, the doctor says to him, hey, come over here. Come inside. I'll show you what all the fuss is about. And he goes into the clinic at the doctor's beckoning, and she shows him a petri dish with the contents of an 8-week abortion. And he didn't expect it to be anything that would shake him at all. In fact, he was eager to look. But when he looks in the tray, he sees there a perfectly formed severed hand and a severed foot. And it absolutely blows him away. Listen to his reaction. I felt a profound and unmistakable kinship with the foot and the hand in the tray, a kinship so strong it was like the rolling of the sea under my feet. I was surprised by my own sadness, by the sense of loss I felt. Strangely, I couldn't tell what I was sad for, but I suspect that I was sad for myself. Pathetic as that sounds, as though I were somehow looking at a version of myself scattered in that basin. What's happening here? What's happening is abortion ceased to be an abstraction for this author when he saw abortion. It was no longer this abstract concept of choice. It was real to him. He's a visual learner like the rest of us. In fact, if you want to test this, when I say we're a visual society, if I say the name Richard Nixon, tell me what pops into your mind right now. Dare I say an image? Most of us, including myself, cannot recite more than a sentence or two of a Nixonian speech. I can't get much further beyond I am not a crook. And for most of us, that's probably true. And this author was no different at all. I brought with me tonight a short tool that we are using nationwide to help people understand abortion at a very deep level that they would be incapable of understanding if we just talked to them about it. This videotape that we're going to show you is not something that I think you need to see. Most of the people in this room, if not all, have already been converted to the pro-life position. But that's not true of the people we're speaking to, obviously. And we want to be able to reach them with hard-hitting facts and arguments, but we first have to open up the communication channels. This tape we're going to show you is about 6.5 minutes in length. Let me tell you what's in it so you can be aware of it and opt out of viewing it if you wish. I hope you'll watch, but I want to give you the option of looking away if you wish not to. You're going to see in this videotape pictures of aborted babies, and you're going to see pictures of aborted fetal tissue remains. If you wish not to watch this film, please look away from the screen, and you won't have to see anything or even hear anything you don't wish to hear, because as a matter of courtesy, we've also taken narration out of the film and have scored it only with music. So if you want to opt out of this, just glance away from the screen, and not even your neighbor will know that you're not watching the film. And by the way, when you use this film in your own speaking, which I hope all of you in this room will, if you introduce the film the way that you just saw me do it, give the audience the option of looking away, tell them what's in it, most people, if not all, will not be angry at you for showing this video. I've been doing this for 7 years. I've had one person get angry at me, and she did not have a good case for getting angry at me. And the same will be true for you. So I want to roll this tape for you. I want you to be aware of its use, and then with the remaining time I have left, we're going to talk about some things we need to do to better communicate our views on this issue. So if we could get the lights down, I would appreciate it. One other thing, if I could just add that whenever I'm using this film with a Christian audience, and if it is confessed, that is always an important statement to make. There will invariably be people who've been wounded by abortion who need to hear that. And if you will preface your remarks and your using of this video with that statement, you will find that people who may have been wounded are not thrown for the traumatic loop they might be if you're perceived as laying a guilt trip on them. Two weeks ago, I visited Gettysburg for about the 5th time in the last 2 years. I'm a huge Civil War buff and enjoy taking my sons to go visit the various battle sites. Even my wife now enjoys going now and then. And we went to Gettysburg, and my boys have asked me, Dad, why did General Lee lose at Gettysburg? General Lee being the Confederate commander. I said, well, son, see that field? Look what Lee tried to do. He tried to march a sizable portion of his army across an open field, moving uphill against Federal troops dug in behind a stone wall. Not a good thing to do. And that's exactly what he tried to do. And we know what happened from the history books. Of course, the South lost that battle, and they lost it badly. And the Federal troops were able to win because they had good ground to fight on. In the abortion debate, pro-lifers too often are like General Lee. The other side is talking about choice. Choice, 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 a term that's very endearing to most Americans. We're talking about baby, baby, baby. If we don't use the pictures, we are fighting on bad ground. But when we use videos like this, we force the other side to defend killing babies, and that reverses the situation dramatically. You should see what happens when I show this video at debates, and it forces my opponent, or opponents, to defend killing babies. They lose good ground. And if you think I'm kidding, I pulled a quote not long ago from one of the heads of the National Abortion Federation. This is a gal named Catherine Colbert, and she was talking about this discussion that's going on right now about partial birth abortion. And she was warning her constituents to be very careful about how they dealt with partial birth abortion. Listen to what she says. She quote, this is an article that appeared in the American Medical News, she urged those attending her symposium not to get sidetracked by their opponents' efforts to get them to discuss the specifics of the procedure. I urge incredible restraint here, she said, to focus your message and to stick to it, because otherwise we'll get creamed. If the debate is whether the fetus feels pain, we lose. If the debate is in the public arena on what the effect of anesthesia is, we'll lose. In other words, does the baby get some benefit from that during the procedure? She goes on, if the debate is on whether or not women ought to be entitled to late abortions, we will lose. Don't take my word for it, take her word for it. The other side is terrified of visual imagery, and you will be amazed at the number of pro-lifers who refuse to use videotapes like this because they're convinced it will turn the public off. Yes, it will if you use it improperly. But if you use it correctly, it has a phenomenal effect on turning them around on this issue. Third reason why pro-lifers fail, letter C. They fail to clarify the only issue that matters in this debate, and that issue is the status of the unborn. People say abortion is a complex issue, and I'm going to argue tonight it is not complex at all. From a moral perspective, it's very simple, and I'm going to illustrate it to you by using an example my friend Greg Kokel has used. Let's assume you're in your kitchen, and let's assume that you have a 5-year-old son, like I do. And I can picture my 5-year-old son asking this very question because he's this kind of kid. Let's say I'm standing in my kitchen, washing dishes, my back's turned to my 5-year-old son, and he comes up behind me and says, Daddy, can I kill this? What's going to be the first question I'm going to ask? What is it? A snail? Have at it. Grab the hammer. Go for it. The neighbor kitty? Whoa! The neighbor boy? Counseling. My 5-year-old, he's kind of a rambunctious guy. I could see him asking this question. You see, everybody in the abortion debate agrees that abortion kills something. But one side of this debate has chosen not to ask the follow-up question. What is it? What is it? That is the key issue. All other objections in the abortion debate come back to that one question. What is it? For example, I will hear abortion advocates say to me, who are you to force your morality on women? And I like to ask a very simple question at that point. Well, isn't the woman who's having the abortion forcing her morality on her unborn child? Oh, well, that's different. The woman's a human being. The unborn isn't. We're back to the issue that matters, aren't we? The issue isn't forcing morality, because these same abortion advocates would not say that a person ought to be allowed to do in their toddler. The issue is not forcing morality. The issue is the status of the unborn. Let's take another example. They will say that abortion is a choice between a woman, a doctor, and her God. The Naomi Wolf article that came out recently, that was her argument. But wait a minute. Would we say that a parent ought to have the right to kill their toddler on grounds that it's a decision between a woman, a doctor, and her God? Absolutely not. So privacy isn't the issue, is it? It's the status of the unborn. As Greg Kokel likes to point out, if the unborn child is a human being, no justification for abortion is adequate. None is adequate. I want to give you, before I move off this point, by the way, is everybody clear on that everything comes back to that issue? And I'll show you more of that as we go through our talk tonight. But all issues come back to that one. And I've seen pro-lifers take the bait and concede that this is a complex issue. But if what I'm saying is true, it's not complex at all. It's not complex at all. Here are 4 little letters you can use to demonstrate that the unborn child, from the earliest stages of pregnancy, is a human being. And I want to give it to you by borrowing something I learned from Professor Stephen Schwartz in his book, The Moral Question of Abortion. Stephen Schwartz said, you can demonstrate the humanity of the unborn child to anybody by using the acronym SLED. S-L-E-D. In fact, you may want to just write that going vertically down your paper. An unborn child differs from a newborn baby 4 ways, none of which are adequate to dismiss its humanity. Here are those 4 ways. The S stands for size. Size. The unborn child is smaller than a newborn, but since when does size have anything to do with the rights that people have? Men are generally larger than women. Ladies, does that mean we men ought to have more rights? I don't think so. Is Shaquille O'Neal more of a person than Gloria Steinem simply because he is larger? So clearly, size is not a good enough reason to disqualify the unborn as human. Let's go to the next letter. L, level of development. L, letter of development. Level of development, we could say, is really not hard either, because yes, an unborn child is less developed than a newborn. But a newborn is less developed than an adolescent. An adolescent is less developed than an adult. Do we disqualify the adolescent or the newborn because the adult is more developed? What about people who are born with disabilities? I happen to know a baby that was born not long ago that had flippers instead of arms. It was less developed than the newborn next to it in the neonatal unit of the hospital. But was it less human simply because it was less developed? Of course not. All of life is a continual unfolding of development, but we don't disqualify people simply because they're not up to our standard. The next acronym, E, or the next letter in the acronym is E, that stands for environment. Environment. Where one is has no bearing on who one is, as Dr. Francis Beckwith likes to point out. Where one is has no bearing on who one is. And I'd like to illustrate that for you by, again, referring back to something Greg Kokel talked about recently. He has a friend who gave birth to a baby girl named Rachel. And baby Rachel was born at 22 weeks gestation. That's not even 6 months yet. And baby Rachel was so tiny when she was born that she would fit in the palm of your hand. And the hospital staff worked heroically to save baby Rachel's life. And they succeeded. But I want to propose I would rather like to ask what your opinion of the hospital staff would have been if, instead of working to save baby Rachel, they had come into the hospital room as she was lying there in her father's hand, and if they had taken baby Rachel and killed her. Well, we would have considered the hospital staff nothing but a bunch of moral monsters, wouldn't we? But do you know that very same baby Rachel, that very same baby girl can be killed through legalized abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy simply because she's located 6 inches away in her mother's womb? Do you stop being human when you leave this room and go to the elevator? Do you stop being human when you leave your house in the morning and walk out to the street to get in the car to go to work? Clearly, location has no bearing whatsoever on who you are. The final acronym is D. The final letter in the acronym is D, dependency. Yes, the unborn child does depend on its mother in order to survive. But if viability is what makes one human, then all those who depend on insulin, kidney machines, heart pacemakers, or any other technological device for their own sustaining of their own life are non-human. What are we going to do? Walk around and paint a big NP on their foreheads, non-person, because they're not viable? Clearly, viability is not an adequate justification for taking someone's life. As Dr. Bernard Nathanson likes to point out, there's no ethical difference between a kidney patient who is plugged into and dependent upon a kidney machine and an unborn child who is plugged into and dependent upon its mother for its survival. So you can see, using that acronym SLED, there are 4 ways in which that child differs from a newborn, none of which is sufficient to disqualify it as being fully human. And you can use that acronym with people to help them see that. I like to conclude my opening remarks in debates with this challenge to the other side. I say to the audience and to my opponent, I say, if you can demonstrate for me that the unborn child is not a human being, I will walk away from this fight tonight. In fact, if you really want to be bold about it, you can say to your opponent, I will concede everything you say. I will concede we ought not force our morality on people. I will concede we ought not force women to have back alley abortions. I will concede that this is a private issue between a woman and her doctor. I will concede it all if the unborn child is not a human being. And all you have to do tonight is demonstrate conclusively to me that the unborn child is not a human being, and I will walk away from this fight. Now, by the time I've shown harder truth as part of my opening remarks and laid the issue out the way I just did with you using the SLED acronym and making that challenge, my opponents have a steep task in front of them, and yours will too, because they now not only have to defend the act of abortion, they have to defend their idea, which they'd prefer not to state, that the unborn child is not a human being. All right, very quickly, some observations on pro-abortion rhetoric. Pro-abortion rhetoric often assumes the unborn child is not a human being. In other words, pro-aborts, generally speaking, do not prove this. They don't state it. They assume it in the course of their rhetoric. We call that begging the question. It's when you assume what you're trying to prove, and I'm sure in this class that's a fallacy that's readily available, or I shouldn't say readily available, one that you're very familiar with. Hopefully it's not readily available in that you're using it. But for those of you that may be unclear about that, what I mean by that is when you assume what you're trying to prove. That's what begging the question is. Here's a rather crude example. If I ask you the question, have you stopped beating your sister yet, what am I assuming? That you've been beating your sister. What's the point I'm likely trying to make? That you've been beating your sister. I'm assuming what I'm trying to prove in that scenario I just gave before you. Let's look at some specific examples of this in pro-abortion rhetoric. When a woman, or when somebody says to you, well, a woman has a right to control her own body, therefore abortion ought to be legal. What are they assuming there? Well, that's what they're stating, but there's an assumption there that's behind that statement. That there's only one body involved in the abortion act. That's what they're assuming. What's the very point they're trying to make? That there's one body involved in the abortion act. They're assuming what they're trying to prove. Here's another example. They'll say to you, well, no one knows when life begins. Therefore, abortion should be legal through all 9 months of pregnancy. Well, if no one knows when life begins and abortion ought to be legal, what are you assuming if you make that statement? You're assuming that life begins when? At birth. What's the very point you're trying to argue? That life begins at birth. You're reasoning in a circle. That's what we mean by begging the question. I'll give you yet another example. We've all heard the back alley abortion argument, where that goes like this: if we restrict abortion, women are going to die by the thousands in the back alleys of America. Well, what is that assuming? I'll give you a clue. It's not assuming. Yeah, it does assume this, I suppose, but it's not the answer I'm looking for. I'm not looking for someone to say it assumes that women were dying. That's not what I'm looking for. It assumes something very distinct. What is it? Well, that's one assumption, but it's not quite the one I'm looking for. That abortions are necessary, that's an assumption, but not quite the one I'm looking for. It's assuming the unborn are not human. Should we legalize bank robbery so that it's safer for felons? Of course not. No one would argue that way. And unless you begin with the assumption that the unborn child is not a human being, this back alley abortion argument is equivalent to saying the following: because some people will die attempting to kill others, the state should make it safe and legal for them to do so. That's what they are arguing, unless they assume the unborn child is not human. Do you see that? Everybody see that? They're assuming what they're trying to prove. That's called begging the question. In fact, if you get Dr. Francis Beckwith's book, Politically Correct Death, he develops this theme at large, and we don't have time to go into it any further than what we just did tonight. But the first thing you will note about pro-abortion rhetoric is that it assumes the unborn child is not human. Top of page 2, Pro-abortion rhetoric also calls into question the humanity of those outside of the womb. The humanity of those outside of the womb. You will hear people say, for example, that the unborn child lacks self-awareness, therefore it's not human. Well, when I was sleeping last night, I don't know that I was self-aware either, but did that mean I ceased to be human? What if you're in surgery and the doctor puts you out with pain medication to perform the surgery? You're not self-aware. Do you stop being human? No. What about a reversible coma? God forbid, you're in an accident tonight driving home, and you temporarily go into a coma from which you will emerge a short time later. Do you stop being human while you're in that coma? Of course not. You remain who you are, even though you are not currently functioning as a self-aware person, because there's something more intrinsic to your humanity than your ability to be aware of yourself. They will also say things like this, that a fetus that is only an inch long can't be human. But since when, again, does size have anything to do with the rights that people have? Large people are not more human than small people. Now, this friend of mine who's a pro-abortion attorney, I debate him sometimes 3 or 4 times a year. He's an ACLU board member. He is also a very ardent abortion advocate. He's on the board of the California Abortion Rights Action League. And whenever I debate him, he makes the argument that the unborn child cannot possibly be human because if you look at its brain development any time prior to week 32, you will observe that that brain looks more like a reptile or a fish than an adult human brain. Therefore, that unborn child cannot possibly be human. And the irony is that he's using the same arguments to dehumanize unborn babies that Darwin and his followers used a century ago to dehumanize women and African Americans. In fact, I like to quote Darwin on this whenever he makes this argument. Nothing quite like knocking out abortion and Darwin in the same debate, but here's an attempt. This is Charles Darwin from The Descent of Man in Selection and Relation to Sex. Listen to Darwin. Quote, "Man attains a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can women, whether requiring deep thought, reason, imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands. If 2 lists were made of the most eminent men and women in poetry, painting, sculpture, music, history, science, and philosophy, the 2 lists would not bear comparison. We may also infer from the law of deviation from averages, so well illustrated by Mr. Galton, that the average mental power in man must be above that of woman." It gets better, though. Gustave Le Bon, one of Darwin's chief disciples, he's the father of social psychology for any of you that may have studied that in college. He says, quote, "Even in the most intelligent races, there are large numbers of women whose brains are closer in size to those of a gorilla than to the most developed male brains. This inferiority is so obvious no one can contest it for a moment. Only its degree is worth discussion. Women represent the most inferior forms of human evolution and are closer to children and savages than to an adult civilized man. They excel in fickleness, inconsistency, absence of thought and logic, and incapacity to reason. Without a doubt," by the way, ladies, this is not me, this is Darwin. "Without a doubt, there exist some distinguished men, or distinguished women, very superior to the average man, but they are as exceptional as the birth of any monstrosity, as, for example, a gorilla with 2 heads. Consequently, we may neglect them entirely." He is using, my opponent is, the same arguments to dehumanize unborn babies that people used a century ago who were racists. Same arguments. In fact, this abortion debate in one sense is nothing new. It's the continuation of a 200-year-old struggle we've been having in this country on this question. How are we going to define legal personhood? Are we going to define it in terms that include those who stand in the way of something we want? Or are we going to define it in terms that exclude them so we can get what we want? And we all know the story here. We certainly did this with African Americans, didn't we? We wanted their free labor, so we justified considering them as less than human so we could enslave them. We did it with Native Americans. We wanted their land. We justified them as being only 2/3 persons so we could take their land. And now we do it with unborn babies. Same old debate. Nothing new here. And that's what we're dealing with. And we have to become more skilled at helping the public see that abortion is the continuation of the civil rights struggle. And when we do that, our arguments resonate. Final thing, and then we'll look at some specific examples of pro-abortion lies. Pro-abortion rhetoric often attacks the character of pro-lifers instead of addressing the issue. Pro-abortion rhetoric often attacks the character of pro-lifers, we call that the ad hominem fallacy, instead of addressing the issue. You've all heard this before. Who are you pro-lifers to oppose abortion unless you're willing to adopt all the babies you don't want aborted? You've all heard that one, right? Well, let's look at that for a moment. What if I choose not to adopt those babies? Is abortion justified? In fact, in debates, I will sometimes have a little fun with this. I'll say, you know what, you're right. I'm the cruelest conservative in the world. I don't give a rip about the mothers or their babies once those babies are born. You're right. I have no compassion in my heart whatsoever. But could I ask you a little question? How does that justify an abortionist taking the life of an innocent child? We call that the so what question. Let me illustrate this further. If I said to you, you have no right to oppose me beating my wife unless you're willing to marry her. If you turn me down, am I justified in what I'm doing? Of course not. Or what if I said to you, I'm going to execute my 3 boys at noon tomorrow unless you agree to adopt them? If you turn me down, am I morally justified in doing that? Of course not. So the issue is irrelevant. It's irrelevant. How individual lifers or pro-lifers act in terms of caring for the mothers and babies is irrelevant to the question of whether those babies deserve to die. Now, I won't argue that pro-lifers have no responsibility. We do, but it doesn't have anything to do with the morality of abortion. All right, let's look at Section 3. I'll go through a couple of these, and then I'll take questions for the remaining time that I have left. I wanted to provide you with a sample of some of the documentation that is available in the manual, Making Abortion Unthinkable, The Art of Pro-Life Persuasion. I regret that it is not available here tonight. There was a slight delay shipping them back from Focus on the Family, where I was recently, and we thought we'd have them here tonight. We don't have them. But I went ahead and photocopied just a couple of sample articles to show you what's in that manual. That manual contains hundreds of pages of documentation from pro-abortion sources that can be used to demonstrate the truth of the pro-life position. There's nothing quite like doing a debate where you hold up the other side's own material to refute what they're saying, especially when they're lying. It's kind of fun, actually. Let's look at a few examples. Women will die from back alley abortions. First of all, the argument assumes what? The fetus is not human. Give that man an A, Nick. Exactly. The fetus is not human. Because otherwise this argument is tantamount to saying because some people will die attempting to kill others, the state should make it legal for them to do so. Now there's an interesting question you can ask to focus the issue back on the humanity of the unborn child. Here it is. Why should the law be faulted for making it more risky for anyone to kill an innocent human being? Now when you make that question known to somebody, what do you think the response is going to be right away? It's different. The unborn baby's not human while the woman is. Ah, we're back to the one issue that matters, aren't we? The status of the unborn. See how everything comes back to that? It all comes back to the status of the unborn. Can I kill this? What is it? It all comes back to that, and this is an example. But factually, is it true that women were dying by the thousands from illegal abortion? Well, it was not, and I'm going to ask you to believe that, not because I say it, but because the past medical director for Planned Parenthood said it during the very year that these women were allegedly dying by the thousands. I'd like you to look with me, if you would, in your handout on page 5. On page 5. This is an article from the American Journal of Public Health. Mary Calderon was at that time the medical director for Planned Parenthood, and she was commenting on a medical symposium that was held in conjunction with the Kinsey Institute, where they discussed in detail the problem of illegal abortion. And one of the clear conclusions from that conference was that abortion was no longer dangerous, whether it was being done illegally or legally. Look what she says in 1960, which again was the time period when these women were allegedly dying. Down toward the bottom of the first column, fact number 3. Abortion is no longer a dangerous procedure. This applies not just to therapeutic abortions as performed in hospitals, but also to so-called illegal abortions as done by physicians. Go to the second column if you would. She writes there, an estimated 90% of all illegal abortions are presently being done by physicians. Call them what you will, physicians or anything else. They are still physicians, trained as such, and many of them are in good standing in their communities. They must do a pretty good job if the death rate is as low as it is. Go down toward the bottom there. She says, so remember, fact number 3, abortion, whether therapeutic or illegal, is in the main no longer dangerous because it is being done well by physicians. Now, can you imagine if the pro-life spokesperson on the Oprah Winfrey show had pulled this out and quoted it to Molly Yard? It would have forced Molly Yard to give justification for her assertion. Molly Yard was making an assertion that she got away with making because the pro-lifer was not prepared to whip something like this out of her briefcase and hold it up for the audience to see. Going on to another one you will hear. One other thing on that note, Stephen Schwartz makes a very interesting point. He says that the true response to back alley abortions is to be outraged at all abortions, to condemn all abortions, not to propose one kind legal over another kind illegal. And he's right on. Letter B, women need late-term abortions for medical reasons. This is just an outright lie, and I'll show it to you by asking you to look at a page from this book, Dr. Warren Hearn's book, Abortion Practice. Now, before you turn there, I want to say just a couple of words about Dr. Hearn. This book, Abortion Practice, by Dr. Hearn, is the leading medical text that teaches doctors how to perform abortions in America today. This is the text you will find if you go to UCLA, USC, any med school in the country, and you want to take obstetrics training, and you will find this book there. Dr. Hearn, in his opening chapter on abortion, defines pregnancy as a disease, as a parasitic illness for which the treatment of choice is abortion. That's his understanding of pregnancy. But Dr. Hearn goes on to point out that the reasons why women are having abortions are not as serious as you might think. And on page 7, I've photocopied a page from his book to show you that. Listen to why Dr. Hearn says women are having abortions. I should add one more thing before I read this quote. Dr. Hearn is a late-term abortionist. In fact, I have an article from him I just received where he describes in detail how to do the procedure at 34 weeks. So he is not someone who is dealing with babies at the 6-cell stage. This is someone who does late-term abortions. Listen to what he says. A study of motivations for abortion has found that the majority are sought for socioeconomic reasons. The impression from clinical practice is that all but a few women seek abortions for reasons that can be broadly defined as socioeconomic, and many cite strictly economic reasons. He goes on to talk about, further down the page, that as a rule, women don't make decisions about pregnancy prevention or treatment on the basis of statistical evaluations and medical advice, but rather on the basis of personal attitudes and necessities. He then says that at times medical considerations may enter in, but mostly it's done for lack of desire for parenthood. The relationship is not stable. The educational status is in question. The emotional status is in question. These are the reasons why the mothers are having abortions, not because they, quote, need them. And you will find abortion advocates using that word need as a justification. They'll sneak that in, and you don't want to let them get away with it. Don't let them get away with it. All right, a couple of others, and then I'll take questions. You will also hear that abortion is only legal during the first 3 months of pregnancy. And I'm going to advise you not to get into a lengthy legal discussion of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, although it would help if you understood those two cases. Roe v. Wade, in its companion case, Doe versus Bolton, said that the state may restrict third trimester abortions if and only if it did not interfere with a woman's, quote, health. The problem is the court went on to define health so broadly you could drive a Mack truck through it. That is such a broad definition that almost anything will constitute as health. For example, what did Warren Hearn define unborn babies as? A parasitic illness. And he goes on to say in that same paragraph that unwantedness is a major health threat justifying a late-term abortion. The court said that the decision for health had to be made in light of all factors, socioeconomic, emotional, and physical. So therefore, abortion is legal for all practical purposes through all 9 months of pregnancy. And by the way, who makes the health decision? The doctor willing to perform the abortion. But let's make it even simpler than that. Forget explaining that to somebody. Let me show you an easier way to demonstrate that third trimester abortions are available. If you'll look with me on your own handout on page 9, I've just included there a photocopy of the phone book. Look down on the bottom, down here, her medical clinic. There are abortions listed there on a walk-in basis at 28 weeks. That's a third trimester procedure, ladies and gentlemen, on a walk-in basis. And it's quite instructive in a debate. I've actually photocopied this onto an overhead, and I just put it up there on the overhead for everybody to see, so they can see that my opponent is not telling the truth when he or she will make the statement that abortion is not legal past the 3rd month and never done after the 6th. Well, there it is, 28 weeks. There's another thing you should look at, though, next page over on page 10. There's a Los Angeles Times article. This is an article where they were interviewing at this time in 1990. They were interviewing Dr. James McMahon. He has since passed away. But at the time, in a feature story in the LA Times, look in the first column. He talks about doing abortions at 32 weeks. 32 weeks, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to know, if abortion is not legal past the 1st or even 2nd trimester, why is it front page on the LA Times that this doctor is performing them at 32 weeks? You might want to look at one other thing, 3rd column over. Notice the reasons why these people are having late-term abortions at his clinic and others. About halfway down, the article cites a clinic director, quote, "The realities that Walsh sees every day," she admits, "can be unsettling. These women know they are pregnant, but not until the 16th or 17th week, when the fetus is kicking and bothering them, do they say, 'Oh, I have to deal with this.'" Going down a little further, "If there is any other single factor that inflates the number of late abortions, it is youth. Often teenagers do not recognize the first signs of pregnancy, and just as frequently they put off telling anyone as long as they can." That is not a medical justification for abortion. That is a convenience abortion. Not because I say so, but because abortion advocates say so on the front page of the Los Angeles Times. All right, one more, and then I'm going to take questions. You will have people say to you that the unborn child cannot feel pain until week 32 when the cerebral cortex of the brain is formed. Now, in my manual, Making Abortion Unthinkable, I talk about why that is on the surface a false statement. Because as anybody who's ever studied human development knows, the cerebral cortex is not even necessary for pain sensation. What's necessary is the brain stem, not the brain frontal lobes or the cerebral cortex. But nonetheless, I want to refer you to yet another pro-abortion source that makes the point that unborn babies do in fact feel pain. And I want you to look at an article that appeared in the British medical journal The Lancet on page 12 of your handout. Now, The Lancet did something interesting. They published the results of a study. The article starts on page 11 of your handout, but we will actually look at the conclusion on page 12. The Lancet published the results of some researchers who, in the process of giving unborn babies aged 19 to 30 weeks blood transfusions, decided to see how these babies reacted to the placement of the needle in their abdomens. And they found that these babies thrashed about violently when the transfusion needle was inserted into their bodies, but they didn't react at all when the needle was placed in the placenta or the umbilical cord. And then they decided, let's go a step further. Let's actually measure the hormonal response rates of these babies to see what they look like. And when they did that, they found that their hormonal response rates to painful stimulation was the same as an adult's, and in some cases greater. But I want you to see the conclusion where they make an astounding recommendation. By the way, these are people who favor abortion rights, who are making this concession here. Bottom paragraph on page 12, the last paragraph of the article, you will see there that they recommend that unborn babies scheduled for abortion be given the benefit of pain medication prior to the procedure. Do you see that there? Right there, bottom of the article. Now here's a great question. When you're discussing abortion with somebody, here's a question you can ask. Ask, do you agree with the pro-abortion journal, The Lancet, that unborn babies ought to be given the benefit of anesthesia prior to an abortion? Do you agree that unborn babies ought to be anesthetized prior to an abortion, as The Lancet has recommended? Now that's a real difficult problem for these people, because if they say yes, what are they essentially conceding? The humanity, aren't they? If they pro-abortion people that can be used to back up what you're saying. And tonight, before I conclude with these two last things, if you purchase that manual, which sells for $32, we're going to do two things because we don't have them here today. First of all, we're going to give you absolutely free of charge a videotape to go with it of a 9-week-old baby waking up in the womb. A first trimester baby using a new technology called embryoscopy, live videotape of a baby waking up in the womb. And we're going to give you that video absolutely free if you purchase the manual tonight, and then we'll have to ship it to you, but we'll take your order tonight. The other thing we will do is, if you want the Harder Truth video to go with that, we are going to give that to you at a discount, and when the session concludes, I'll meet those of you that are interested in that. We will give you the video and the manual at a slight discount, kind of a package deal. That's the Harder Truth video you just saw. If you want that video plus the manual, we will do that for you. But at the very least, those of you that purchase the manual, as a way of saying we're sorry that we didn't have the manual here tonight, we will give you that embryoscopy video absolutely free. So if you'd like to get that tonight, you can. That offer, by the way, applies only tonight. All right, last two things here. Abortion is needed to prevent economic hardship. The question you need to ask is, when human beings get expensive, do we kill them? Finally, people will say the unborn are human, but they're not persons. You need to ask, what's the difference? What's the difference? Why should anyone accept the idea that there's such a thing as a human who is not a person, and watch them just sit there and stutter? Okay, I'm going to close right there. We've got about 15 minutes before we have to end this session. So what I'll do right now is just take questions on anything I have talked about to this point. Go ahead.
The question is, the best way to combat the scientists who claim that the fetal parts produce, so much medical improvement in terms of taking out the immune systems of aborted babies and implanting them in rats and using this for AIDS research and what have you. How do you combat that? What's the best way to go about combating that?
How do you refute those or respond to those who say fetal tissue harvesting is a good thing because it enables us to fight diseases on other fronts? Is that essentially the question? You need to confront it morally, and you need to confront it factually. Morally, this is no different than what the Nazis did. They took people and said, these folks are going to die anyway, so let's see how they react. We'll line 12 of them up, we'll send a bullet through each of their heads and see how far that bullet goes, and that'll tell us how well the human brain can protect itself against invasive stimuli. Well, obviously that was an unethical thing to do because it ignored the question of the victims. Were these victims human beings? And if so, did they have rights that superseded the medical community's desire to have technological information. So you need to make the point that when people advocate using other human beings for experiments on grounds that these people are going to die anyway, the question we need to ask is, do those of us who are going to live longer have the right to kill those who are going to live shorter? And then you submit them to all kinds of cruel experiments. On the medical front, I will tell you from my own reading in the medical literature, I've seen 1 to 2 cases where fetal tissue transplants have been proven somewhat beneficial. One has been an experiment that was done in Chicago on eye transplants, fetal eye transplants into the cornea of people who have advanced cases of eye disease. They've found some success in treating that using tissue from aborted babies. The other has been back injury issues where they have taken the spinal cord tissue from these unborn babies and have used it to fill in holes in the spinal cord of adults with advanced back problems or advanced back spinal cord disease of some sort. So those are the 2 that are being highlighted in the medical literature now. But my question is, even if we could solve all the world's ills with the tissue from aborted babies, how does that justify killing these babies if they're in fact human? That's the issue.
I had a question. With the breakup of the family and with the government pulling the wool over our eyes and working around people that just don't even care, where have we gone wrong in the compromise? Even the Christians don't have the trust. And how can we change that, do you feel? To get to them to understand the issues that are at hand.
Oh boy. Explain that again. I for some reason not understanding.
You know, with
your
the
question.
breakup of the family,
Right.
with people just non-committal, compromising. I know with the guys I work around, when you bring up an issue, they just brush it off and walk away.
Yeah.
How can you wake them up?
Okay.
I know the visual's good, but
Absolutely.
I mean,
This video will wake up and make this issue relevant to all but the 20% that are hardcore pro-abortion. And that 20% you're not likely to reach with anything. They're going to remain where they are. But again, is that your customer? Is your customer the 20% that are locked into that position? No, your customer is the 60% who can be reached. And I have found that coworkers, people I work with, I mean, I'm amazed at how people who wanted nothing to do with this issue, when they see a video like that, it breaks their heart a lot of times. I speak in churches, and I wish you could see people in evangelical churches, large evangelical churches, who have absolutely no clue on this issue. I've sat with pastors in their studies and showed them this video, and these guys shake their heads and go, we haven't preached on abortion ever, because we've relegated it to a political issue. We had no idea. In fact, I've developed a survey, a congregational survey that can be administered. With the help of Greg Cunningham, I developed this, and it's designed to show church leadership that the people in the congregation itself have no clue on this issue. If you survey the average congregation and say, is abortion legal through all 9 months of pregnancy? Oh, no way. Should abortion be legal in cases of economic hardship? A majority of the people are going to check yes, based on our experience. See, these are people that we need to reach, and they're reachable in our churches. Your Sunday school classes, I don't know where all of you go to church, but I would advise you to get this video and show it to your adult Sunday school class, then sit down with your pastor and show it to him. And if you don't want to speak to your Sunday school class, you can call me and I'll come speak to your Sunday school class or your church. David Hawking showed this video at Calvary here about 2 years ago. We had just pulled it off the